Welcome into another edition of Tide and Tiger. Scott Griffin here along with Rodney Orr of Tider Insider and TiderInsider.com with our post-spring, post-A-Day edition of what went on. A lot of interesting things happening out there. Rodney, how are you?
Man, I'm doing fantastic. Scott, how are you?
I'm doing good. And let's just give me general thoughts. A few here as we start, just generally, then we'll get to specifics of what you saw at A-Day.
Well, I thought that it was typical A-Day. I thought that, obviously you look out there and you see a ton of talent. It's certainly not meshed together as a complete team yet, but we see that every year. Wasn't a particularly exciting day. Generally, A-Day isn't. But last year, maybe it was a little more so. We had some big plays in that game last year, but only had a couple in this one. But overall, Scott, I think there was a ton of positive things that we can talk about today that we saw on Saturday.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. And let's start with the quarterback position. Jalen Hurts, let's be honest, he struggled. Nick Saban tried to protect him with some comments about the first-team defense and all those things, and certainly that's valid. But he missed some throws, made some pretty good throws too. But I thought he was very average in a time where he really needs to not be average.
Yeah, I think, first of all, preface my comments by saying it's A-Day. These things, as far as quarterbacks go, aren't necessarily set up for them in terms of a game plan to attack a defense or whatever. So I think we have to keep that into perspective. And, it's all about learning and developing. And I think that's one thing that they've spent a lot of this spring on with both of these quarterbacks and both Mac Jones and Jalen Hurts, and then see how you kind of respond in the A-Day game. And I thought Jalen, the big thing that stuck out to me was a couple of things. And I mentioned this in the press box during the A-Day, that something about Jalen's body language did not seem good to me, or positive, or whatever that means. I just felt like that he just didn't seem to have any bounce to him. That was number one. And number two is I just see a guy that, to me, lacks confidence throwing the ball down the field still. I just didn't see it. I thought most of his success was throwing the short underneath stuff. Thought he did a lot better in the second half when they gave him just simple, easy underneath throws to make. I thought that was very helpful to him. But as a guy who's already started 28 games, to be honest with you, if you looked at it, and you can't, again, I want to be clear, it's difficult to judge anything by A-Day. I would not have looked at that, looked out there on the field and said, this guy is a 28-game starter and a guy who's, played in 2 national championship games.
No, he looked very off. And in fact, Mac Jones looked a lot better. Now, he was going against the second-team defense. But again, with Mac Jones' lack of experience, I think you've got to read things into that, too. The ball comes out quicker. The decision-making is decisive. It seems like with Jalen, his decision-making is just still not decisive.
I thought Mac Jones was willing to pull the trigger a little bit. Now, he did throw a pick down the middle, but I just thought he seemed to be more open to throwing the ball, getting rid of it, as you said, releasing it. And I thought, again, Jalen seemed reluctant. Again, I realized they weren't playing against the same defense, and there was some pressure there that Jalen created some problems for Jalen at times. But I also thought the indecisiveness in terms of, when he drops back, maybe not having an idea exactly where he's going with it, or if that first guy wasn't there, then all of a sudden the play breaks down. It's all about rhythm. We've heard Dan Enos this spring on the sideline watching him talk about, I want a rhythm passing game. I want rhythm. I want rhythm. I want us to, get rid of the ball on time. He's talked about that repeatedly. We've heard him. And that was one thing that if you kind of watched Saturday, I didn't get the feel there was any rhythm, especially when we were watching, Jalen Hurts and even to some extent at times with Mac Jones.
Jones did a lot of good things on Saturday, 289 yards for folks listening in, 23 of 35. As Rodney said, a pick, couple of touchdowns, not many long throws, but managed the game, got the ball out, and I thought, utilized the entire field, whereas Jalen didn't. Now, we'll get into more about Jalen into a little bit later on. What's the next thing that stood out to you as far as importance?
Well, to be honest with you, I thought the most encouraging thing as I kind of step back and look at it was Joseph Belovas, the freshman kicker. Thought he was outstanding. He had 5 of 7 on his field goal attempt, Scott. And, the way he banged home a 49-yarder and a 48-yarder, I thought was pretty impressive. So that was one of my big takeaways was, Alabama struggled at times or had been inconsistent, obviously, over the last few years with their place kicking. And, if they've got a guy like that can nail it from 48, 49, 50 yards, and can also be very, very reliable and consistent from inside, 40, 45 yards, then that's a huge weapon for this team, especially given, how powerful they're going to be on defense and, the things that we see offensively, their ability to score points. But if they can have a field goal kicker that is reliable, that even makes them, to me, Alabama, that much more of a complete team.
Yeah, Joseph Belovas has done absolutely fantastic so far with a guy that hasn't played a lot. Now, we know that Tua, and I think Nick Saban pointed this out, Tua is normally the holder, so Mac Jones has had to be the holder. So even that's been a little discombobulated this spring.
Yeah, and everything seemed to go well Saturday, and that's been a big deal. Nick Saban pointed that out, and that's things that we don't see, Scott. None of us really know exactly how the execution of it from the snap to the hold. Sometimes there's little things that are off that, are difficult to detect that maybe doesn't really reflect in terms of the way Nick Saban sees it on the kicker. But apparently it went really well Saturday because everything was smooth. And again, I thought Joseph Belovas was he shared what the player of the game, I think, with Mac Jones, and I thought deservedly so.
What about the punting?
Well, I thought Skylar DeLong, not just watching him in the game, but pregame, I thought he hit some good ones. He shows some ability with his leg. I think it's consistency, hitting the ball, whether it's his drop and the way he hits it at times, maybe. I think that that is something that he needs to, polish up on and probably will, hopefully, over the off season as we go into August camp. But I thought he showed potential. I thought he definitely showed some potential with good leg strength at times and also the ability to drop the ball inside the 15, 20-yard line a few times. So certainly he has potential. Here's the thing with him, though, and this is what, from a fan's perspective, what he's going to be up against is he's following J.K. Scott. I mean, which the guy was almost perfect. J.K. Scott was virtually perfect in his career. My opinion, the best that I've ever seen at Alabama, clearly. So I think a lot of people are going to judge him by J.K. Scott, which isn't necessarily fair. But I think he does have the ability, Skylar DeLong, to be a very solid punter.
Yeah, I do too. He didn't get the height that we're normally used to seeing with J.K. Scott. He got some distance, but I thought he was really terrific inside the 20 with the way he kicks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's crucial. I think that's really key, having the ability to pin the team inside the 20-yard line. And he did that a few times. And, again, I think we have to keep in mind he's a true freshman that just got here this spring. And I think as he continues to get comfortable, and he also now, don't forget this, he has the benefit of being coached by Jeff Banks, who does a great job with the specialist, has in his career, has that reputation. So I think Jeff Banks can take this spring and build on that with Skylar DeLong as we head into August camp.
Okay, so Brian Robinson did pretty well, I thought. Had 7 carries, 30 yards. Ronnie Clark got a lot of work. Robinson also with 6 catches from Mac Jones out of the backfield. That stood out to me, that his ability to catch and Jones getting the ball to him. And then the other thing is we talked about Jalen Hurts with 15 carries, and how many were on designed runs? Not very many, if any, that I remember.
Yeah, I think probably all of them. were on scrambles or, forced out of the pocket, whatever it is. I think that was most of that on Jalen in terms of his carries. Now, back to Brian Robinson for a minute. We've talked about him many times when we've discussed the running backs. Of course, we know about Damian Harris, a two-time 1,000-yard rusher. We know about Najee Harris and all of his credentials and what he did in the championship game in the second half. And we've talked about Brian Robinson repeatedly, too, that, we feel like he's certainly on that level with both of those guys. He's a lot, or let's say he's similar to Najee Harris in a lot of ways. And I think that Brian Robinson is a fantastic running back in his own right. I think when you look at these three guys, and if they can get Josh Jacobs healthy, because he's a different kind of runner. I mean, obviously he can do things. He's extremely quick. He runs with some power. He's fast. He's a big play guy. He can also be very, very dangerous in the slot as a receiver or out of the backfield. So I think when you add all of these guys together, they're very hard to see a better running back quartet in the country than those four guys. And once again, when Alabama gets into the season, when the offensive line is they've got the pieces there, and when they're all put together, and they've got tight ends that can block and also catch the ball, I just think Alabama is going to be very, very strong running the football this year. Going to be very difficult to slow down running the football.
A lot of people have kind of dinged the offensive line. I think it's a little unfair because you'll have four guys with the guys that started this game on the first string offensive line that are playing different positions. Only Jonah Williams is playing the position he did in spring. Matt Womack's out. We know about the other things going on there with Pierce Baker at center, Jedrick Wills and Leatherwood on the right side, Cotton flipping over to the left side. I think it's too early to judge these guys yet because there was a lot of talk they didn't have a good game. There was a lot of defensive pressure, and I think that's a good defensive front they're going against, very athletic. But also, this is kind of new. These things take time to develop.
Perfect. That you summarized it perfectly. I mean, when you look at it, first of all, the good news is that the defensive front is ahead of the offensive line at this point. That's what you want in spring practice. If your defense is ahead and doing well, you can be very confident about that because you look at Alabama's offensive line and you say, well, it's a work in progress right now. They've got the talent. They've got the pieces to the puzzle. They've got the potential. And this spring has been about kind of finding the right combinations, who can do what, moving guys around, creating versatility up front, and all of those things. They're not going to be the cohesive unit right now that they're going to be 4, 5, 6 weeks into the season. So you can't expect that. And I thought that's probably what we saw on Saturday. Again, you've got Alex Leatherwood, who was working at left tackle. He certainly has played some at right tackle, but he was working at left tackle earlier. He was at right tackle by the end of spring. Jedrick Wills spent the first part of spring at right tackle. He slid into right guard. Pierce Baker, of course, at center after starting 3 years at left guard. And you mentioned Cotton flipping from right guard to left guard. And so there's a lot of shuffling that went on, and they didn't even settle on that group. I say settle. I mean, really start honing in on developing that group probably until midway through spring practice. So, again, it's a work in progress up front. Matt Womack was out all spring with the foot injury. He's expected to be back either at right tackle or competing for one of the spots up front once we get to August camp. So I think that's a great assessment that you had there.
How do we read the defensive line then? Because you could turn that around. We know that they've gotten better this spring, but when you lose a Deron Payne and other guys, you wonder about that front four a little bit.
I just think it's depth. I really think that they have to develop some depth up front. I mean, Bugs was great this spring. He worked inside. He worked outside. I think he's a lot more mature Isaiah Buggs than he was last year. I mean, obviously, he transferred in as the number one junior college player in the country, but it took a transition period for him to learn what it takes to be successful on this level. I think he's matured and he understands now what it takes, and he's had a great offseason, and he's had a great spring. On the flip side, I think also Raekwon Davis has taken the next step. He had a good offseason. He had a really good, spring. Consistency, Nick Saban pointed out, was basically the key with him. But I think Raekwon's ready to take it to the next level. I think he had, 8 tackles in this game. I think this is the second A-Day that he's produced, big. I think last year he had 10 tackles on A-Day, and again, 8 yesterday or on Saturday. So he's a guy that I think is those two will be dominant players potentially. But I think the big thing is, too, Quentin Williams had, a great spring. Working inside some, but also outside. He's a playmaker. LeBron Ray flashed a few times, I thought, on Saturday. I think Fedarian Mathis is going to eventually be a really good player. We saw Stephon Wynn, the true freshman, who played some with the first group on Saturday. They rotated him in there. He's got a chance. Now he can go through the off-season summer workouts and, hopefully be even in better shape and condition once we get to August. So all of those guys are going to be counted on. Johnny Dwight has an opportunity to kind of establish himself, hopefully to get some reps up front to sort of rotate in. And then also, let's not forget that Tavita Musaika, the College of San Mateo, a community college player who is transferring in and will be here this summer as an interior defensive lineman. He will certainly be helpful. And then we also have Christian Barmore, who's coming in as a true freshman. So, where he will be, we really don't know until he gets here, but certainly that will be another body. And then the guys on the outside, we can talk about Terrell Lewis, who puts his hand down a lot. Anthony Jennings did not participate in spring practice, but hopefully he'll be 100% in August, which we think he will be. And then you've got Christian Miller, who, again, these guys put their hands down at times and rush the passer and other things. And I think Chris Allen, the sophomore, rising sophomore out of Baton Rouge, had a good spring, a really good spring, and is starting to develop. So when you look at all of those guys as front guys, I think Alabama, again, they could use some depth on the interior, but they still have a chance to be one of the best fronts in the country.
Josh McMillan led the white team with 9 tackles, 1 for loss. As you said, LeBron Ray, 4 tackles, all of them for losses, plus 2 sacks out of that 4. Chris Allen had 2 tackles. There were 2 sacks there as well. Dylan Moses with 10 tackles. Raekwon Davis with 8 tackles. 2 of those were sacks. Quentin Williams, as you said, 6 tackles. 2 of those were sacks. And then Christian Miller had a couple of sacks out of his 4 tackles. So there was some pressure on the quarterback. I thought Josh McMillan stood out to me. Like you said, LeBron Ray made some plays. So they really did get some playmakers, because normally, as you know, with Alabama, most of their tackles are going to be linebackers and safeties. In this particular instance, and again, it's a watered-down scrimmage, basically, but that front 7 really got in a lot of action tackle-wise.
Well, the name that stands out to me is Josh McMillan there when you gave his stats. Now, if he can carry that over into August camp and really be a guy who could provide some depth inside at linebacker, that would be huge. I think Markel Benton is another guy, is a redshirt freshman. If he could step up, and he did show some signs of that this spring, if he can do that behind Mac Wilson and Dylan Moses, then, Alabama could certainly become more solid with that depth. But especially Josh McMillan, because he's been around, and to be honest with you, a lot of people have kind of counted him out. But as we know, Nick Saban never gives up on players. We've seen it repeatedly where guys later in their careers come on and, develop and become solid contributors. And hopefully number 40, Josh McMillan, can be one of those guys.
All right, let's talk about Jalen Hurts and Tua Tagovailoa. That's the elephant in the room, pardon the pun here. It is my opinion, and you just react to this if you would, that Jalen Hurts' father coming out saying what he did a week before spring practice is over, I think that means Jalen Hurts is definitely transferring. Why else would you say that? Why else would you do that? And what's going to change in a week? And now that he's had a bad A-Day game, not that if he had thrown for 400 yards, it would be that different either. But to me, it's inevitable with all that's gone on. Your reaction?
Well, I don't have all the facts. It's just my read on it, my reaction to what you're saying. And if I had to make that reaction and read, I would say that I would agree with you. It's apparent that it seems that Jalen Hurts is on his way out, and it may be sooner rather than later. And again, I don't know that for sure by any means, but if you just look at all the signs and indications are that his dad coming out, the timing of it was really awkward to me, especially because you had, as you mentioned, a week or several days left, 3 practices at the time when his dad made those comments, and you had the A-Day coming up. And, Nick Saban has never one time indicated which direction he was leaning in this quarterback situation, although I think we all know or have an idea who, is probably the future. And this is not something that is a criticism or a negative pointed at Jalen Hurts as much as it is just saying, that Tua Tagovailoa looks like a very, very special player. I don't think there's any question about that. Everybody recognizes that if you look at it on in an unbiased viewpoint. And that's, again, it's not that Jalen hasn't made great contributions to the team over the last 28 games that he started. It's not that he's not has some talent of his own, but it's just the fact that Tua Tagovailoa looks like a special prospect at quarterback, and he's done some magnificent things. But with his dad coming out, Jalen Hurts' dad, making those comments, I mean, certainly you look at it and you say, well, I mean, the handwriting seems to be on the wall. This is not a media thing, Scott. This is not something that the media has dreamed up. This is something that his dad took to another level with those comments last week. He chose to make those comments. So that's something that I think needs to be considered. And also I would say this, that, when I looked at Jalen Hurts in the game on Saturday, again, I keep in mind that it is an 8-day game. I don't think you can overreact to that one way or the other. But I just thought his body language, and I said it in the press box, his body language did not look positive to me. It was almost at times like he was going through the motions, to be honest. So it really makes me think that, would not surprise me. I don't know it for a fact, but it would not surprise me if he was gone sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I think that's the read, and there's a couple of more things, too. I think Nick Saban's the hot mic that picked up on his progress and different things during the game where he commented about basically that, Jalen's not moving the team and the third-string quarterback's moving the team. I think that's very telling. And then I thought he was real calm last week when asked about Averion Hurts' comments, Jalen's dad, and, normally he would get a little testy, a little defensive. I thought he was calm, almost as if, this is going to solve itself. Did you get that feel at all? Because you were there physically at the press conference.
Well, first of all, I think, number one, I need to be clear that Nick Saban has been very professional and fair in this quarterback situation. I mean, he's never publicly tipped his hand. And I think he would love to keep Jalen Hurts here. What coach would not like to have, quarterback depth like that? A guy that's 26-2 and a guy who's extraordinarily talented like Tua. So there's no question he would love to keep, Jalen Hurts here. But I think realistically, like everyone else, I'm sure he understood that just probably wasn't going to happen. And, now it does seem to be playing itself out. And I would agree with you. He seemed to handle the question very, very well in terms of, he wasn't the question was not something that irritated him. I think he obviously expected it. And like you said, in some ways, seemed very calm about it.
We can't read him. We can only theorize, which is part of the fun of these kind of things, is just kind of throwing things out there for people to think about. The bottom line is he was not tore up about it like he can get when he's asked a question of that ilk that Cecil Hurd of Tidesports.com talked to him about. So as we wrap up, were you encouraged if this plays out like we're talking about with Mac Jones's performance in the spring in A-Day as being the guy that will be one play away from probably being the guy if that ever had to happen this fall?
I thought he threw the ball with more confidence than Jalen Hurts. And, Jalen started 28 games. Again, we talk about the differences in the defense, but that hot mic comment that you said Nick Saban made, that certainly does not seem to take into account the difference in the defenses, does it? I mean, he certainly saw where, Mac Jones was stepping up regardless of who he was playing against and making some throws and moving the football down the field. So I think that has to build some confidence in terms of what Mac Jones potentially can do. Obviously, he doesn't have the experience. He's not nearly the athlete, can't scramble like Jalen Hurts, but probably, to be honest with you, he's a higher quality passer. That's his style of play versus a different style that Jalen brings. So I think he could execute this offense. I think he's the kind of quarterback that Dan Enos has worked with in the past and developed into really good players. You look at the Allen brothers up at Arkansas. So I think Mac Jones fits the offense and fits the bill. The question to me is, number one, is you have to keep Tua healthy. The hand this spring has been an issue with the two injuries, but also just the overall quarterback depth. I mean, it's kind of scary. You really like to have 4. Alabama may only have 2 on scholarship. So that could be an issue in terms of the depth. And it does, as you look forward to that, if that's the case, and Jalen Hurts is not part of this in August, that's a scary thing in terms of the numbers.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about recruiting, then we'll wrap it up. Taulia Tagovailoa decides to come. I thought that was another telling thing this past weekend. With the Jalen Hurts situation, joining Paul Tyson. Alabama added more. I think they have, 8 commits now for the 2019 class. And suddenly, with all the stars added up so far, they have vaulted ahead of Oklahoma as the number 1 class right now. It's obviously early, but, December will be here before you know it. What can you tell us about the recent developments since last time we talked?
Well, of course, last night they had one guy decommit to safety from Lakeland, Florida, Kathleen High School, Brendan Gant, who's an excellent player. But that's not really a surprise, I don't think. He committed back in December and, started looking around. So that's not really a surprise there. But you mentioned the commitments over the weekend Taulia Tagovailoa. Not a surprise. We've mentioned it on this podcast here last week and also previously on Tighter Insider for several weeks. We've mentioned that we thought that Taulia would commit to Alabama at some point this spring, probably after A-Day, but he decided to go ahead and do it on A-Day. The outstanding player. I mean, you've seen him, Scott. I mean, the guy, if you talk to people, they think he's a right-handed version of Tua. I've even heard, one quip was that with Tua you have Randy Johnson and with Taulia you have Kurt Schilling. I mean, it's just, 2 really talented guys and very similar to each other. One throws left-handed, the other right-handed. But so I think it's a big pickup for Alabama, obviously, for a lot of reasons. You mentioned Paul Tyson committed recently as well. I think he's a developmental guy, has a lot of tools. I think as he progresses, Paul Tyson, and in his development, he's got a chance to be a really good player as well. Now, the commitment yesterday in our Tighter Insider Sunday morning recruiting notes, we mentioned to keep an eye out for Tanner Bowles, offensive lineman from Glasgow, Kentucky. We felt like he may commit very soon, and he did yesterday afternoon, in fact. About 6'4", 6'5", 280, 285 or so, Scott. A guy that's a 4-star offensive lineman. I think he's very versatile. He could play inside. He could play outside. He's got really good feet. A tremendous prospect, in my opinion, and talking to some people that have seen him play more than I have, they certainly think that he's got the versatility to be an excellent player. And it's just, as you look forward and you start looking at this Alabama offensive line that they may put together in recruiting, they've obviously got Pierce Quick out of Hewitt-Trussville, a 5-star offensive lineman with a lot of versatility. Now they've got Bowles. And I think as you move forward, I think they're still in excellent position with Amari Kite out of Thompson High School. Some people think he may end up a 5-star tackle prospect. Darnell Wright, the number 1 offensive tackle in the country out of West Virginia, was in this past weekend. I think Alabama's in great position with him. Of course, he's a 5-star player. Alabama, Tennessee, and I still think Ohio State's on the outside. Some people think they're the number 1 team, but I think it's Alabama or Tennessee with Bama in front. And then, last but not least, Clay Webb, who may be the number 1 interior prospect on the offensive line in the country, out of Oxford, Alabama. Spent the last 2 weekends in Tuscaloosa, but was in Georgia at Georgia's G-Day game this past weekend. Kirby Smart really trying to make a strong push for him. But I still think, Alabama is in great position with Clay Webb.
Yeah, and he's the guy that they foresee moving to center, possibly at 6'3", 297, right? Which would give Alabama even more
Correct.
Quality. That he's a guard now, I think. Isn't that correct? How you understand it?
Yeah, he's an interior player that, as you said, a lot of people project that he will eventually end up as a center in college. And obviously Georgia's trying to make a strong push for him, Scott. But I don't think it's inconceivable to say right now, I don't know that how it's all going to shake out. Obviously, it's still early, but it's possible, depending on how these ratings evolve, which they change, as you know. I think it's possible Alabama could land as many as 4 5-star offensive linemen. So that would be, actually that'd be phenomenal, almost unbelievable to put together a group like that.
Well, yeah, because 4 or 5, as you know, with an entire class is terrific.
Right.
And to do it at one position would be just otherworldly. Finally, camps happen in June. That's where a lot of recruiting evaluation goes on, and really where you get even an uptick from there in how many commits you get. Do you see anything happening then with guys coming back on campus for an extended period of time?
Yeah, with the spring evaluation starting right now, I think obviously recruiting is going to be at the forefront, preparing for these camps. They've moved all the camps now into the month of June. They split them up over the last several years between June and July, but they're going to get all the camps done in June, make their evaluation earlier, continue to make those evaluations, which I think part of that has to do, obviously, with the early signing period, and make some really key decisions on the directions that they want to go much sooner this year. So I think a lot of that in June will be key as we start to move forward. Obviously Alabama needs some defensive linemen. Ishmael Shropshire, the number 1 defensive tackle in the country from Amity, Louisiana, was here this past weekend. Scott, got mixed reviews on that visit, by the way. I'm not really sure how well it went for him, but I think LSU will be more of a factor there than maybe people were talking last week. But I think Alabama would do extremely well up front, defensively. We've talked about DJ Dale in the past from Clay Chalkville. So let's say it right now, Scott. Let's say it on this podcast. I think DJ Dale commits to Alabama possibly as early as this week, a 6'2", 320-pound interior defensive lineman. I think Alabama's in great shape with Fatui Tuitele. I'm not sure if that's the exact way to pronounce it, but he's from the same high school as Tua Tagovailoa out in Hawaii, in Honolulu, at the St. Louis High School. I think they're in great shape with him. He's the number 2 rated, defensive tackle in the country. And they had some others that visited this past weekend. I think they'll do well there. Last week they got Shane Lee, an interior linebacker prospect, inside linebacker from up in Baltimore, same high school as Iyabi Anoma, who's an excellent player. I think they're in great shape with N'Kobe Dean out of Mississippi on the interior, who some rate the number 1 inside backer. We've mentioned the kids from Mississippi on the defensive line, Nathan Pickering, Byron Young, Jaron Handy. Alabama's all on all of those guys. So I think the front and the linebackers, Alabama's going to do extremely well. And, they got a commitment last week from Christian Williams as a cornerback. And now I want to mention this guy too, Scott, since he was here this weekend from Tulsa, Oklahoma, Booker T. Washington High School. Safety Daxton Hill one of the top in the country. Had a great visit. Be interesting to watch that one. I think it'll be real interesting to keep an eye on Daxton Hill.
All right. You can get all the top recruiting information and really whittle it down. Now, you're going to get recruiting information from a lot of places, but at titerinsider.com, you really get it narrowed down to real, because there's going to be 100 commitments out there. But Rodney Orr and his staff to get it down to the nitty-gritty of what to look for with the information you just heard like that. Remember, all the videos and podcasts on there as well. It's only $48 a year to do that. That's, 3 or 4 lunches in a year's time to get the best information. Be sure you check out titerinsider.com for more information on that. For Rodney Orr, Scott Griffin saying so long for now. We'll talk again very soon right here on Tide and Tiger.